Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of season 2 of Painting a Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. Apologies in advance here, I've had a cold this week and I don't think I'm quite over it, but I just wanted to make sure this episode was done, so I'm going forward with it. If it's too bad, let me know in the comments, and next time maybe I'll find something else to do in the in-between weeks if I have a little bit of a sickness like this. In any case, today we're going to be doing step 2 on all of these 3 miniatures, that's to say Jaime as a prisoner, Cersei Lannister, and Bronn the Mercenary, that we were working on last episode, getting them all primed up and dry brushed and ready for color. Now that they're ready for color, of course, our first step is colors. Now, there's no particular logical reason to me starting with the red for Cersei's dress, except that I thought it would look really good and I wanted to see it ASAP. Picking areas that are going to kind of motivate you and get you moving forward is really important when you're painting. That way you don't lose steam partway through a project and just sort of stop being interested. Not that I was there yet, that's normally a later in the project thing, but it just seemed like a cool thing to do, so I got right into it with the red paint. There are going to be relatively few colors between these 3 miniatures actually, because both Jaime and Bronn the Mercenary are quite drab characters, devoid of any faction allegiance. And only Cersei is wearing anything particularly interesting, which is to say her flowing robes. These flowing robes are actually going to be perfect for painting with inks like we do here. The real value of using inks as washes rather than using paints in your usual sort of base coat, highlight, shade kind of format is that your inks are they're pre-thinned to such a large extent that you're really going to get the effect of any relief or any details that the sculptor put on the miniature ahead of time. As you can see here, where her skirt is, it's wonderfully sculpted to have all these flowing ends and it's sort of bunching up on the ground behind her and in front of her. The ink is already flowing right into those recesses while still dyeing the raised areas. You can see the raised areas aren't staying white. They're getting, pink. They are being dyed with the application of ink. So that ink is taking that texture and just making it pop for us. If you'd been applying straight up slightly thin acrylics, you would probably get a thicker, bolder color on it with the first coat. Especially on a white primer, red acrylic would look really strong. So that's a plus, but you wouldn't be getting as much definition right off the bat. It would be filling in and coloring the crests and the crevasses equally, to such a point that there wouldn't be a huge difference between the two, and while looking up close you would see the difference. You really would have to be going in and putting in additional layers of shading and highlighting to get those to look smooth. Of course, using acrylics also gives you a lot more control over your application, and you'll see my ink here, this red ink, and this is pretty common with red inks as far as I've been able to tell, comes out a little bit pink, and is going to have to be strengthened up with a second layer in any case. Obviously acrylic paints give you a little more control over that application, and while, a little side tip, acrylic paints do dry darker than they look when you first apply them in the vast majority of cases. That's really not that drastic. It's not as bad as, for example, this sort of transition from red to pink that we're seeing here. That being said, this red to pink, I've planned for it, I've run into it on previous miniatures. What we're going to be doing later is thickening up that red and giving it a little more juice by mixing some magenta in and putting another coat over top, with a little bit of our airbrush flow improver, which I showed in the last episode when I used it to sort of in lieu of a paint thinner to get the blockage out of my airbrush. That mixture of some magenta in with the red gives it a lot more depth, and while obviously I don't want her dress to be outright magenta, the mixture of the two put over top with some flow improvers so the lower layers soften up a little bit and blend with the upper layers will give us a pretty nice color for the dress. I'm pretty happy with it. I'm not happy with everything about the dress, and we'll discuss that a little later, but I was happy with the color that it came out as. Of course, you could get a very similar effect by using a red acrylic paint as a base, applying a shade if you have it, Although for something like this dress, I would really recommend you find a red shade and not use, you know, one of your standard black or brown shades that you see a lot for wargaming miniatures. While those are great for making miniatures look dirty and such, I think you'd be disappointed with someone like Cersei Lannister, who's a non-combat unit in the game, which basically means she doesn't fight, she sort of stands back and does political things to assist your army. Her looking dark and dirty and grungy wouldn't be quite as appropriate as it would be for example, Bronn in the back, or even prisoner Jaime. So, if you could find a red shade that you could put over top of your red acrylic, that shade would flow into the recesses as well. And if you couldn't find a red shade, you could start with a dark acrylic, and then just manually paint all of the raised edges with a lighter acrylic over top once the first layer has dried. But I do feel that doing it that way, A, is a lot more time consuming, and you have to be quite precise when you're doing it. And also the edges between the highlights and the deeper areas are a little bit visible. It gives everything a very painterly look, and it is quite striking at a distance, but it isn't as smooth as the transition between, you know, the ink and itself, which is what we're getting here. Red ink on the high areas, red ink on the low areas. The only difference between being a gradient of concentration between the high and low areas makes it look a little bit smoother, in my opinion. It's not perfect either, and for those who are willing to invest the time, wet blending your highlights into your base color with normal acrylics can be excellent. But I don't want to confuse the issue too much here. I am trying to present some beginner techniques, and that's why it's just layer of red ink, you know, like you threw some red ink on that guy, or in this case girl, and now you've got a really quick, really, you know, fairly striking for the amount of effort we put in terms of just slathering red ink on, effect that you can carry forward with your miniatures. Hopefully that should mean that, you know, the goal of all of these tutorials is to make tutorials that are real time, so that anyone can kind of pick them up and follow along in real time with every one of my brush strokes. I always found when I was watching tutorial videos on YouTube, yeah, they show the most important parts, but then they skip forward, and I go, well, how did he paint under the rim of that, you know, pant leg in this case, or skirt or something? And I had some questions still, where they would say things and take them very much for granted. This isn't as true anymore. I've noticed a lot more painting channels specifically explaining what dry brushing is, for example. But when I first started, it was very common to see videos or written tutorials, even better, online that would just say, ah yes, and then go on to dry brush things. And I would be like, what's dry brushing? I have paints, they make my brush not dry, you know? So that's why I'm trying to release these real-time videos, and then cap off every series with a sort of summary video that shows it all in the more traditional tutorial format. And obviously my technique needs a little bit of work on, but that's what we're aiming for, is we're aiming for these summary videos at the end of every series of real-time videos, so that if you really did just buy your first board game box and you got no friends who paint miniatures, or you move around a lot or traveling for work and you just want to do this for fun, you can take a look and see some reasonably cheap techniques that you can use to achieve a pretty good result early on. And unlike, I would say, a lot of beginner techniques that sort of rely on, well, settle at this point, and you know, when you feel more confident, make it look better later, these techniques don't require you to settle, I would say. Learning how to paint with washes, which is what we're doing here, learning to paint with these inks, is a technique that you can use all the way up to professional level painting. In fact, if you browse Instagram for miniature painters and such, you'll find there's some really, really striking examples of people using washes to paint up particularly large beasts or heroes and stuff at a professional level. And it can look really, really good. So this isn't a throwaway technique that's just, oh, here you go, beginner, you know, here's something that'll make you feel good. It is something you can build on, but it's also something that rewards you early on and sets you up with some good tools for just feeling like you're achieving something. Hopefully that helps you with learning. Personally, it helps me with learning if I feel like I'm actually getting somewhere early on, where starting out with acrylics, I obviously moved on and I learned, you know, your Citadel 3-step process, or your Foundry whatever step process. I went through all those different steps that people will suggest to you for learning how to paint with acrylics. And eventually it works, but the first examples where you're just sort of splotching acrylic paint onto a thing and you have no idea how to thin your paint or how to darken it or whatever, so it looks like a 5-year-old did it, is very encouraging. But that's really neither here nor there. There's some other excellent examples of tutorials on YouTube and elsewhere on the web for painting with acrylics, and I really strongly recommend you look at them because you very well might prefer the look of that and might prefer the workflow of that to what I'm showing here. If you do prefer this though, then stick around. Right now what we're doing is we're putting on our brown ink onto first Braun, who obviously has a lot of brown on him because fantasy miniature makers and fantasy illustrators and such just kind of throw leather at a guy until he looks hardcore, I think. At least this game doesn't suffer from the abundance of belts that seems to be very common in a lot of the fantasy franchises, but it still relies very heavily on leather and fur, right? That's the sort of aesthetic for Game of Thrones. So you're going to find your brown gets used a lot, which is kind of convenient. I also use brown as the base for flesh tone, for well, pretty much any flesh tone, to be honest. Although, of course, in this case, again, I'm painting all three of these as ordinary Caucasians befitting the largely Western European setting of Game of Thrones. At least, you know, continental Westeros' northern hemisphere, as it were. So yeah, just go around and doing all the leather bits. You'll see I'm not thinning my inks or anything at this stage. I'm trying to get everything done reasonably quickly, so I'm just blocking everything in with the ink outright. Try and keep a good picture in your mind of what areas are going to be painted what color, because that can kind of give you a good idea of what you're doing here. For example, I know that Ron's hair is going to be black, and I know that his armor and metal bits are going to be painted a mixture of black and silver. So both of those are going to cover over mistakes fairly well, which gives me a lot of confidence when I'm painting stuff like that collar he has, the sort of leather rim on his weird chainmail infinity scarf. That will, you know, if I overdo it on one side, I'm going into a black area that's going to get covered up, and if I do overdo it on the other side, I'm going into a silver area that's going to get covered up. So keep that in mind as you go along. It's not a huge thing, and obviously I'm not saying like, oh, whatever, just slather the whole guy in brown ink, it'll all be better in post. But if you're the kind of person who stresses out about it, like I kind of do sometimes, maybe that'll help you relieve your chest tightness. The other thing is, getting the right paintbrushes is a massive step for this kind of stuff. You're really going to want to find out what paintbrushes work for you and which ones don't. That took me quite a while, actually, and I'm still experimenting, I'm still discovering new paintbrushes, but if you don't have a good small bullet point paintbrush at the very least, that's probably the one main thing you're going to want to get, because if you're struggling along with some sort of like Artist's Loft or Dollarama crappy paintbrush that's just losing its bristles in your miniatures all the time and making your paint jobs awful because it doesn't lay down paint evenly, where you can see this is, I believe it's a Citadel shade brush, so one of the Games Workshop ones, it's doing a really good job on those big flat surfaces of just laying the ink out reasonably evenly, and I can just push the ink around to where I want it. If you get like a cheap brush, it's not going to do that, you know, it's going to leave hairs in wherever you're brushing, and it's going to make everything look bad. And you're going to feel frustrated because you're going to think it's you. It's not you. Well, I mean, it might be you, but you can't conclusively say it's you until you've got, you know, a good brush in your hands. So, you know, go out of your way and just spend the $4, not on a pack of 17 brushes at Dollarama, but like spend $4 on a reasonably good brush with a nice bullet tip that looks pretty tight, and some brush soap. That'll be another, I don't know, like $10, $15. But brush soap is going to be invaluable as well, because you want to be able to take care of your miniature brushes, so that they keep that point and they stay flexible yet slightly firm, so they'll fight back against you and really just put the ink or paint wherever you're trying to put it. So yeah, you want to look into a good brush. It was something I struggled with for a while, because I just kind of went, paintbrush must be a paintbrush. No, it's not, you know. Obviously guys who are quite skilled and have been doing the hobby for a long time will tell you you can be as talented, or as successful using bad equipment as good equipment. It's all about your own talent, but the reality of it is they are exceptionally talented, and it's still a challenge for them. They have to work around it. And when you're just learning the techniques for painting miniatures, the last thing you want to be doing is learning the techniques, but also learning to try to work around, a bad piece of equipment you're just hanging on to. Obviously, if you can't help it, then do your best. But I would say don't suffer unnecessarily, and don't interfere with your learning of painting techniques and color theory and all that kind of stuff, because you're frustrated all the time that you're leaving brush hairs in your miniatures paint job, or otherwise, struggling with the materials you've gotten for the painting. And I don't read that wrong either. I'm not saying don't get into the hobby unless you got professional grade stuff. I'm just saying, like, there's a saying I heard a while ago during my training for my job, where someone said, any idiot can walk 10 miles with a rock in his shoe, but, if you're smart enough to just stop at mile 1 and take the rock out, it's going to be an easier time. If you're finding that there's some element of your workflow that's a rock in your shoe, take an honest look at it and see if you can change it. Don't just, it's not just bad painters who blame their tools. You'll notice that a lot of the good painters are also using god-awfully expensive tools. And, a $4 paintbrush from Games Workshop like this guy is not that expensive. And to be honest, I don't necessarily recommend the Games Workshop brushes. They weren't that impressive. They're not that great compared to the, brushes you could get at a hobby store or something like that for similar prices, if not less. I know Canada and the United States have Michael's, the art store. That's where I do a lot of my shopping, and Michael's has decent bullet-pointed brushes in their sort of level 2. I don't know if you've ever been there. If you haven't been there, there's a level system for the professionalism, quote-unquote, of their materials. Sort of level 1, level 2, level 3 for painting. If you look in their sort of level 2 acrylic, even level 3 if you want, but I didn't notice that big a difference, you'll find some really decent brushes. I've been sort of going on tangents here. I'm going to blame it on cold medication. But you'll note at this painting step, I'm just applying the brown ink to all of the areas of flesh, because like I said, I'm going to be using it as our base for flesh, but also to all of the areas that I think are going to look good brown. Mainly leather stuff, but also Jaime's tunic. And I went in and did the little laces on Jaime's pants. I also made sure to catch bronze belt and scabbard as well. When you're kind of picking what areas are going to get what paint, especially with a paint that's sort of bland and generic like a brown, try and keep in mind what areas are going to be touching each other. If there's multiple areas that you think should be brown that are going to be touching each other, which was the case with Jaime, where, in his drawings he's just sort of a big blob of sad dirtiness because, he's just lost his hand and therefore his livelihood. If all those areas just get painted in the same brown, it's going to be a really, really boring miniature. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to be getting a different brown to do other parts of Jaime's outfit in particular, just to break it up into sort of different stripes of different color as you ascend the miniature. That way, no two areas that don't have to be are the same color touching each other, Otherwise, they're just going to blend into each other, and if you're looking at it from tabletop distance, there's going to be no detail to look at, really. There's going to be no interest, no visual interest at all on your miniature. So again, go in with your brown ink here and just get all of the flesh areas. On Cersei in particular, you're going to want to be the most careful. Her hair is going to need to be blonde afterwards, as is Jaime's. And so you don't want to get too much brown on that, lest it sort of interfere with the blonde getting a smooth finish. And also her red dress, you don't want it to look dirty, or at least I didn't want it to look dirty because I want it to be, really clean and fine looking. And my ink's dried, I've just noticed, so I'm just going to put a little dab down because I need to do a touch-up here. But yeah, as you're going along, sort of have a couple brushes ready for doing touch-ups anywhere that you go over. In this case, a little bit of the hands kind of escaped me, so her hands are quite difficult to do, especially with a wash like this, where it's going to try to flow if you've overcharged your brush, so just be aware and be ready to correct it. The next thing we're going to be using is Cork Brown from the Vallejo Medieval Colors paint set. Vallejo acrylics are very good. They come pre-thinned for you and they're very easy to use, but they're still an acrylic paint that's going to lay on quite thickly. This can be a good thing. I'm going to use acrylics for areas that I actually want to cover later on in this process, like like when I start highlighting the faces. But at this stage, I'm still trying to paint with washes, and I'm still trying to preserve as much of the surface detail as I can. So I'm going to be thinning it out with a little bit of the airbrush flow improver, as well as a little bit of brown ink, to just make a slightly off brown. It won't have much contrast from the other brown, but it will have some. You know, I would say in this case I didn't actually thin it enough. I would put a little more flow improver, or maybe just a little bit of water in to thin it further if I were doing this again. But it's tough to do because acrylic paints, you know, they give you a lot of colors to work with and stuff, but there isn't that much pigment versus the amount of medium in them, so they don't, if you thin them too much, they just don't lay down color evenly, and it looks pretty awful. So keep that in mind if you're going to thin down acrylic paints. But of course, I have them on hand because acrylic paints are still kind of useful, and the Vallejo Medieval Colors set is also where I got all of my metals, which is to say my bronze, gold, and silver, which I do use extensively, and my cork brown, which I use occasionally. The rest of the colors I really haven't touched since I started painting mainly with washes like I do now. In my previous series, I mixed a little bit of yellow with some brown to get a gambazon color. In this case, I wanted to try doing something a little bit different. Honestly, it didn't make a huge difference, but working with the acrylic was a little harder, so mixing inks to make this wash for the gambazons and for dirty pants is probably what I would do in the future. I'm trying to cut the acrylics out of at least the early stages of my painting as much as possible, just to avoid having to mess with different consistencies of wash and how they settle. That being said, this extra coverage that it's giving right now might be exactly what you're looking for when you're working on something, because it is filling every area and being a little thicker on the raised areas. Yeah, you can see I'm sort of realizing it's thicker than I want it to be. And now, like anything else, if you try to fix it after the fact, it's just going to get worse and better and worse and better, and it's going to be hard to deal with. Obviously, this is ending up just wiping off large areas of it with the flow improver. But yeah, push your paints around until you're happy with it. It's worth remembering, not only can you strip a miniature if you don't like how it turned out, which obviously I use personally as my motivator to drive forward and just paint miniatures, even if I think it's not working out. The process of painting is practice, and if it didn't work out in the end, you know, if I look at it after a sober night, after painting it and varnishing it and finishing it up, and I think, that wasn't great. Yeah, here I'm going to use the paint thinner to just thin out the shield. It did pool a little bit, and you can see I'm just going to push it around, and that'll take away most of that effect. But yeah, if I look at a miniature after, you know, a sober night's thought, and I still think it looks awful, well, I can strip it, and I get to start again. I actually released my episode on stripping just a little while ago. You can take a look at that. And we're going to be painting those stripped miniatures in an upcoming series, so that's exciting. But also, while your ink or paint is still wet, there's a lot you can do to sort of push it around, re-wet it with a water brush or a paint thinner brush, as we're doing with the flow improver here, and just move it around, add different tones, mix other colors in to make it look differently, or even just remove it altogether with a Kleenex or some paint thinner. So feel confident in what you're doing, and try to react aggressively if you do make a mistake, because the sooner you get to it, the easier it is going to be to fix. Now here, yeah, I'm still struggling with the consistency of that. I was hoping using the Vallejo cork brown would give me a different color from the other brown easily, more easily than mixing it, but obviously for the amount of mixing I've done so far, I don't think that was the case. I probably really should have just mixed together some inks and gotten a wash of the consistency I was expecting. Now, I discussed Flow Improver a little bit in my first season, but I'll just mention it again here because obviously we're using it extensively, and you might be wondering why I'm doing that instead of thinning my inks with water. And thinning paints with water is perfectly fine. Thinning inks with water is perfectly fine. The advantage Flow Improver has is that, as the name implies, it improves the flow of a product. So what it does is it sort of takes away the surface tension, so that instead of, if you think about putting a water drop on a surface, it makes sort of a dome, because it has surface tension holding it in that shape. And then when it dries around the edges of that dome, you're going to get a deeper color than at the center, because around the edges all of that surface is slowly flowed down and it's sat there for longer. And you get what's called tide marks. You get these sort of rings or lines of color. A flow improver takes away a lot of the surface tension of whatever you mix into it, and you won't get tide marks like that. It'll flow more evenly into all of the cracks and crevices and surfaces. So I tend towards using flow improver more than water, especially when I'm trying to cover large areas like I am in this case. And pretty much any case where we're doing this painting with washes, we're covering very large areas with the wash all at once. And while, even with flow improver and ink, you're going to get sort of patterns in it, which I think sort of add to the texture of it. Once we put a matte varnish on at the end, I think it looks quite good. You won't get tide marks if you've added the flow improver, so you won't get these clear lines of where the material flowed to and then sat. So that's worth keeping in mind. Obviously, flow improver is an added expense, and if you don't want to pick it up, you can just pick up water and get a similar effect in terms of thinning things. It just has slightly different properties that are worth considering. So this has been a bit of a rambly episode. I kind of wanted to talk about everything and nothing at the same time. It's a bit information loaded. I'm going to put a title at the beginning, and I'm going to say it again now. There's an index in the description if you want to bump around to different parts of what I was talking about today. If you found any of it useful or something, obviously let me know in the comments so I know what's useful. And let me know in the comments if something I said is obvious or offensive or something, and you don't want to hear it. But yeah, there'll be an index so you can bounce around and sort of listen to different parts, choose what you're interested in. Here, I'm wicking away some of that paint because now I've thinned that acrylic so much that it's flowing just out of control. Yeah, basically I don't really recommend doing what I did there, but it did sort of work. It gave me a bit more of a sandy color to his trousers and to the leather over top of his cloak, so I guess that's something. But anyway, yeah, we're just finishing them up here. We're going to add a little bit more of that beige color thinned down to various areas just to try and differentiate them from the ordinary brown that I get with my inks. The difference doesn't look that stark here, but once I added my matte varnish, it did show up quite a bit more. But I would, if I get the opportunity and the inspiration and everything, probably try a different color scheme in the future. Not that this one is bad, and it does sort of convey the drab, sad feeling of Prisoner Jaime, so I was pretty happy with that, but it's just not interesting to be drab and sad, and I do want to paint things with visual interest. That's kind of part of the goal of a visual medium. Anyway, thanks for following along. Yeah, like I said earlier, I'm sorry I was sick this week. This is the best I could get my voice for this episode. I hope you're still able to follow along. I hope you learned something from it and it was interesting to you. And if you did like a particular part of this or dislike a particular part of this, obviously throw it down in the comments. I'd love to see it. Thank you all to those who have subscribed to me so far. That's awesome. And I hope to see you, coming back for future episodes. If there's something different you'd like to see, just throw it down in the comments. I'll read it and I'll look at that, and hopefully it could help me make a better product that'll help you learn something or otherwise be entertained by this. Anyway, until next time, go play some games.